Content note. The romance of a rogue contains unhealthy relationship dynamics and the romanticization of stalking. Listen at your own risk. Hi, I'm Morgan, and today I'm excited to read to you from The Romance of a Rogue by Ruby M. Ayres. Chapter 6. When Christopher tramped wearily home in the early hours of the morning with Beauty at his heels, he found that Bruce had lit the fire and was making the tea. He greeted Christopher apologetically. "You didn't mind my running away. I couldn't stay. I hope you did not mind." "Not at all. You were quite right. And Miss Lee, how is she?" "I wanted to see her home, but she would not allow me to." "Aw." Christopher gave Beauty her supper, took off his boots, and sat down by the fire with a little contented sigh. "There is a great deal of sadness and trouble in the world," he said sententiously, "and we are so helpless in our efforts to alleviate it." Bruce made no answer, and there was a profound silence till he asked abruptly, "What sort of a salary does Miss Lee receive?" Christopher shot a swift glance at him. "I believe she gets £2 a week," he said after a moment. £2! The rogue laughed as he thought of the ease with which he had once spent double and treble that amount. £2! Was that all she had to live on? No wonder she had called life rotten and looked forward to its ending. Christopher went on thoughtfully. "I may be wrong, of course, but my belief is that she has someone who is dependent upon her, someone she has to support. She has never told me so. She never speaks of her private business, but I am a man of intuition, and my instinct tells me that she works not only to keep herself, but another." Bruce made no answer, but his heart gave a quick throb of apprehension. Charmian's father was dead. Who then could be dependent upon her? She had no brothers or sisters. Who, then, could it be for whom she had to work? Presently he said abruptly, Would it be possible to increase her salary, say by another £1 a week, and without her knowledge?" Christopher considered. "We are all paid weekly, and by the management," he said at last. "How would you propose to arrange matters? It would not be easy, and, pardon me, but she is very proud, and I understood you to say that you were without means." Bruce Lowry laughed self-consciously. "You are indeed a man of intuition," he said, "and you are right. It is I myself who wish to give Miss Lee the extra money. And as to being penniless, well, this morning I called the solicitor who arranged my affairs 6 years ago, and he told me that some worthless shares I had bought then and forgotten have turned out to be very profitable. Gold has been found on the estate, and with care I shall have sufficient money to make me independent for the rest of my life." Christopher held out his hand. "The luck has turned for you already, and I am glad." "Thanks, but with regard to Miss Lee," the elder man went on, "as I have just said, she is very proud, and were she to suspect—" "I leave that to you, to see that she does not," Bruce said quickly. Christopher nodded gravely. "I promise to do my utmost." "If I could find out where she lives," Bruce said restlessly, "is there nobody who knows?" "I do not know myself, so it is unlikely anyone else would at the elixir, as I am the only member of the orchestra she speaks to at all. Like you, I have often offered to see her home. We leave so late, and the streets are not nice at such hours for a woman alone. But she has never allowed me to escort her, so lately I have given up suggesting it." Bruce rose and stretched his arms wearily. "It's a devil of a world, John Christopher," he said whimsically. Christopher smiled. "Hitherto, I admit that fate has beaten you," he answered, "but your day will come. Even in the short time that I have had the pleasure of your friendship, 2 pieces of good fortune have come your way." "2? "The money," Christopher said, "and the finding of a friend who needs your assistance." Bruce flushed. "She finished with me 6 years ago," he answered, remembering Charmian's words. Christopher shook his head. "So you will no longer need my poor hospitality," he said after a moment. Bruce turned eagerly. I was thinking, before you came in, why isn't it possible? I should be only too pleased and honored if you could see your way, you and Beauty, to share a home with me. We could find a little house in London or the country, whichever you prefer." He stopped, warned by something in the elder man's face. "Beauty and I will be only too pleased to visit you if you invite us," he said courteously. "But we like our own home. We like our independence. Eh, my dear?" Beauty wagged her feathery tail in lazy agreement, and Bruce flushed. "My suggestion was entirely selfish," he said. "I hope our friendship will continue for many years," Christopher answered gravely. He would not pursue the subject. He turned the conversation in other directions. He talked of himself and his past life, of the famous people he had known, and of the conquests he had made in his youth. He brought down the photographs from the mantel-shelf and explained them. He talked of Patti and Melba and all the great singers as if he had been their contemporary, and Bruce Lowry listened with respectful pity. Christopher was romancing, he knew, and he knew also that he had lived in his world of romance for so long that he had grown to firmly believe in it, and in his own high place on its dream pinnacles, he really believed that he had sung with Patti. He really believed that mere professional jealousy had kept him from being as great a bass as Signor Foley. In his excitement, Christopher rose and strode about the room, waving his long, thin arms and gesticulating wildly. He sang snatches of songs from the famous operas and laughed in a strange, demoniacal way, and all the time Beauty's soft eyes were fixed upon him in grave admiration. Christopher was a great man to his dog, if to nobody else. When he had exhausted his energy, he dragged an old theatrical box from a corner, took off the strap that bound it, and showed his treasures: stage costumes, wigs, dummy weapons, and all the paraphernalia of his profession. When he put on the Mephisto cap and mustaches, Beauty whined an uneasy protest and growled, and that brought Christopher back to earth. He tore the cap from his head with a self-conscious laugh, and sat down, drawing the spaniel between his knees. "So she disapproves of the evil one," he said fondly. "Excellent judgment, my dear, most excellent." He soothed and caressed her, then packed his treasures away in the old box once more and strapped it up again. It was nearly 3 o'clock when at last Bruce flung himself on the hard couch and almost at once fell into a heavy sleep. And he dreamt that he was dancing once more with Charmian, to the strains of the Destiny Waltz, that he held her in his arms, and felt her heart beating against his own. And then, all in a moment, everything changed. Her face grew pale and horrified, and she tried to free herself from his grasp. "I finished with you 6 years ago," she said wildly, and when he released her and turned bewildered to look in the glass to see why she had so suddenly become afraid of him, he saw that he was wearing Christopher's Mephisto cap and mustaches. In the morning he remembered his dream, linked with the words which Charmian had said to him overnight. "It was as if I had seen someone tear a mask from your face and show me a devil grinning instead." And he understood for the first time how terrible his crime must have seemed to her. To himself, knowing that he had not intended to kill, vile as his victim had been, it had never seemed as bad as it must have done to the world and Charmian. She had judged him from her sheltered life, by the bare facts of the case, and the horrible publicity, by the long cross-examination, and finally by his sentence. Her love, which had set him up upon a pinnacle, had failed when the world had called him a murderer. With such a handicap, how could he ever hope to undo the things he had done, ever expect to recapture the years he had thrown away? There was a letter from Mr. Smithers in the morning. Bruce had given him Christopher's address, and he wrote asking him to dinner that night. "Come and dine informally. We shall be quite alone. I know your first thought will be to refuse, but I beg of you not to. Let us help you to get back to the world you ought never to have left." Bruce showed the letter to Christopher. "I shan't go, of course," he said. Christopher looked at him with raised brows. "Why not?" Bruce shrugged his shoulders. "I've forgotten my party manners," he said gruffly, "and I've no clothes. Besides, I want to go to the elixir with you." "You must please yourself, of course," Christopher answered calmly, "but if I may venture to offer advice, you are behaving foolishly. Go and dine with this Mr. Smithers," Bruce interjected, "and accept the kind help he offers," Christopher added. He saw the indecision in the younger man's face, and he added with a little smile, "Your absence from the elixir tonight should do good and not harm, if those are your thoughts." Bruce sat silent for a moment. Then he said, "Oh, very well. And if she asks for me?" "That is not very likely." Christopher answered. Bruce knew that, and tried not to know it. He could not rid himself of the memory of Charmian's face as it had looked during those few moments of unconsciousness. Something of her lost youth and innocence seemed to have returned to it, probing his heart with ungentle fingers. What had happened in her life besides his tragedy to change her so greatly? She blamed him, but he told himself that it could not have been he alone. Who else had helped to push her down to the sorrow and want in which he had found her? He was jealous of the unknown factor, whatever or whoever it was, jealous of the 6 years of her life in which he had had no share. A dozen times during the day he made up his mind not to go to Mr. Smithers, but in the end Christopher's persuasions won, and at 7 o'clock he found himself giving his coat to a trim maidservant in the house that was so replete with memories. He looked round him with a little smile. 6 years had not changed the world so greatly after all, save when he looked at Charmian. It almost seemed as if life had stood still while he was in prison. And then he was shaking hands with Mr. Smithers and meeting the kind, diffident eyes of his wife. "We are so pleased to see you again," she told him. "And, Stella, you remember my daughter, Stella, Mr. Lowry?" No, he had not remembered, and he flushed a little as he bowed to the girl who came forward rather shyly. She was small and dark and dainty, and she wore a gray silk frock with a short frilly skirt that made her look almost a child. "You were a little girl when I last saw you," Bruce Lowry said awkwardly, and wondered why he had said it, seeing that still she was only a little girl. "I remember you quite well," she told him. "I remember you mended my doll once when she broke her arm." Yes, he remembered that too, and the recalling of the little incident seemed to remove the last trace of embarrassment. She sat beside him at dinner, and there were flowers on the table, and silver dishes, and shaded lights, and the warmth began to come back to Bruce Lowry's heart, and hope, and the joy of living, and for a little while he was almost happy. It was afterwards, when he and Mr. Smithers went into the library to smoke, that the cloud of remembrance fell again. There was a photograph of Charmian on the mantel-shelf, a portrait taken some 10 years ago in the Smithers' garden. Charmian at her best and happiest, laughing and free from care, endeavoring to hold a struggling puppy in her lap. Bruce had stooped over the fireplace to knock the ash from a cigarette, and it was as he stood up against that Bruce had stooped over the fireplace to knock the ash from a cigarette, and it was as he stood up again that his eyes fell on the picture, and he broke off in what he was saying to stare and stare. What a contrast between that sweet girl and the woman whose hard voice had mocked him last night. What a contrast between that woman and Stella in her little gray frock. The injustice of it struck him to the heart, and his face was white when at last he turned. He knew by the expression of Mr. Smithers' face that he understood what had happened, and he said with a little rough laugh, "You would not know her now." Mr. Smithers cleared his throat agitatedly. "If there is anything one can do," he said helplessly. Bruce shook his head. "That must be left to me, and even He could not go on. They talked on different subjects for some time, till there was a little tap at the door, and Stella thrust her head round. "Mother says, aren't you ever coming into the drawing-room?" Mr. Smithers rose with alacrity. "At once, my dear, at once, if you've quite finished your cigarette, Bruce." "Quite, thank you." They went to the drawing-room, where Mrs. Smithers sat working by the fire, and the flames threw opalescent lights on the gray sheen of Stella's frock. "Do you care for music, Mr. Lowry?" Mrs. Smithers asked. "If you do, you must get my little girl to play for you. Stella, where's your violin?" Bruce made an abrupt movement as if to check her, but then drew back with a deep breath. He sat with his eyes fixed on the fire while Stella played. Mrs. Smithers accompanied her, and the very homeliness and charm of the scene tore his nerves unbearably. Once Charmian had had a home like this, had been a beloved daughter, sheltered and happy. He turned his head and looked at Stella. Her head was bent over her violin, her pretty face utterly absorbed, and Bruce Lowry watched her with hungry eyes. He wanted her to be Charmian. He wanted to see Charmian back in just such happy surroundings. He wanted to see her in pretty frocks and with the light of happiness again in her eyes. He hardly heard the music. He only saw reflected in this scene many other scenes from the past. "You must come again. I do hope you will come again," Mrs. Smithers told him when he rose to take his leave. "We shall always be pleased to see you." "Yes, do come again," Stella urged shyly, and her eyes followed him with a little eager light in their depths as he went away. And that is the end of Chapter 6 of The Romance of a Rogue by Ruby M. Ayres. Thank you for listening to this chapter, and I hope you return soon for the next one. Have a great day!